So, Denny, we're going to try this again. How you doing over there in Georgia land?
Georgia land is fine, thank you. The rest of the world's going crazy, but Georgia's calm.
How's the weather these days? Is it getting colder out there?
So I wasn't actually here last winter, but the temperature gets just below freezing. So there'll be a little bit of snow, maybe a few inches. It's
That's
not so
it.
bad here.
Oh,
Yes,
wow.
yes, yeah, very nice.
Compared to Beijing, would you say it's colder?
Oh, good. No, 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 no. Really, it just gets just a little bit of below freezing. Sometimes it will get a little bit windy, but not like Beijing. I mean, I remember sometimes with the wind, especially at night, it could get with the wind chill maybe 20 below
Yeah.
Celsius. Yeah, it'd
Yeah.
be nasty.
It's picked up a little bit in recent weeks. It's one of these. It's the season where you can go. I guess up until last week, the leaves were still on the trees, a lot of them, and you could go take nice pictures. And within the first week of November, basically that changes. So your
Yeah,
last weekend of October, sort of that last time you can see full trees. Uh, but now they kind of look emaciated, kind of skinny, scrawny, not
yeah.
so pretty anymore. So I wanted to leave the city and go outside, like to the outskirts, to take a few pictures if I could. But I don't know if there's much point anymore at this point, since a lot of the leaves are probably blown off, at least most of the trees. In my compound mostly as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, I have I was asked a question recently about being an English teacher, an ESL teacher, and I know you've been teaching for a while, and I think you also have the CELTA certificate,
Yes,
right?
that's correct.
Okay, so the question was basically, what's it like to be an ESL teacher overseas, and what sort of what do you need to get started? What's your input on this?
All right. Well, I I I taught in China before I earned the CELTA. That was 2004. At that time, China only required, and even to today, I think China only technically requires a university degree and also 2 years work experience, not necessarily teaching, just work experience in general. But
Okay.
there are ways that companies find around that. What is absolutely required, a minimum, depends how desperate they are. The real
Hmm.
true minimum is, honestly speaking, a white face and a pulse.
Okay.
There are still places like that.
Not entirely true, because there are requirements for the visa that they have to
Oh no,
apply
they,
for. Right.
oh no, there are places, countries like that in Central America or in
Right. Where, I mean, it sort of pays to be a foreigner from an English speaking country, which there are seven of them: Canada, United States, UK, Ireland, Scotland,
yeah.
South Africa, and Australia, and New
Oh,
Zealand.
right. I was going to say Scotland's usually included in the UK.
Yes, Scotland is right, and I'm sure some of our colleagues would love that I separated them, but you're right; they are part of the UK. But it's like it's seven regions that are sort of considered to be native English speaking, so it's easier for them to apply for visas if they want to go work in another country.
Yes.
That being said, I remember you saying that when you were taking your CELTA, and I remember with my CELTA, um, the it wasn't just people from those countries. It was, and it wasn't just white people. Wasn't just white men. It was actually quite a selection of people. For my CELTA, I think there was an even division between men and women from all over the world. What about yours?
So this was 17 years ago. I'm trying to remember.
Wow.
And and there was a Korean young woman who just graduated from college. There were two other white girls, American white girls in the class who'd also just graduated from college. One was middle class, one was rich, and I really have a hard time picturing that she stuck with it afterwards.
Mhm.
there was an American woman who was in her latter 20s who was also learning to be a bartender. So Judy was really a lot of fun. But
Cover
I
all your
also,
bases, teaching English and bartending. I mean, you can work anywhere with those two skills.
that's true. That's true. And then there was me who was just 22. There was another guy, Brad, an American, but he was married to a Chinese woman and already had his own school set up in Beijing.
Right,
Tony was teaching Spanish Secret Service. He lived in Spain but came back to get the CELTA. We
right,
had a Brazilian woman in her early 30s, and then we had an American woman from Florida who was in her 40s. And this was in New
right.
York City. And
That's a good mix. That's a good mix of people.
yes, it was. And we all had, oh, and we also had a woman who had just who just converted to Islam and was
Hmm.
preparing because she was going to be going to Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East, then as now, they look very favorably upon the CELTA and also the Delta to the expense of master's degrees. That's been changing, the
Hmm.
last 5 years, but there's still that preference.
Yeah. For my CELTA, in terms of nationality, I remember there was a Greek woman. I can't remember. There's about 12 of us, I think, total, maybe 10. I can't remember them all. I know there was a Russian lady who I'm still in touch with. There is a Greek lady, and there's another Brazilian guy, and I can't. Other people, they were either from Canada, like local, either from Montreal, where I was doing my CELTA, or other parts. I can't remember everybody though. It's been a while. Mine wasn't as long ago as yours, but not didn't really keep in touch with quite a few of them. We all kind of went our own ways. I think I was the only one who was coming to Asia at that point because I had to do the CELTA in order to go work at the university that I eventually did in China. They told me you have to pass that in order for us to give you the job, even though it was like I went to do the CELTA. Well, I got the job. I went to go do the CELTA. I went to China, and then I passed. So I think it was like almost in that order, so sort of thing where I was like, this is so. What happens if I don't pass, sort of thing? I guess I just have to do the course again, but which I probably would have done in Beijing at that time. We didn't mention what the CELTA is, which is what some people actually might not know. So the CELTA, correct me if I'm wrong, Certificate for English Language Teaching of Adults
Uh, two adults,
to Adults. Okay.
yeah,
Of
which means
to
16
for,
or above,
right.
actually, right? Adults 16, so upper secondary school and university. But you can also get an add-on for young learners to your CELTA, which is, I think, another 2 or 4 weeks.
And so what does that give you?
Well, so you're trained, adults and children learn very differently. I've never taken it professionally. I have never, I've occasionally tutored middle schoolers or
Yeah.
young children, but I've never done that at all. I've intentionally stayed away from kindergartners or elementary schools.
Do you not want to teach kids, or is it just not a skill set that you care to develop?
I I need some basis to be able to work with my students because usually in this kind of setting, there are language problems. And at least if we have some of the same experience or can connect in some area or way, it's easier for communication. With a four, I've spoken for a long conversation with a 7 or 8 year old about their hobbies, their interests, their likes. But after half an hour or an hour, the kid has nothing else really to say. And when I try doing imaginary things, what would you like to do in the future? What would it be like to live in the water or something like that? The kids I've dealt with anyway aren't
Yeah.
interested,
Yeah.
aren't interested
Well,
about talking about it. And
I
so
I'm not sure we could be too surprised about that. But yeah, it does require a different skill set, which is why the CELTA is geared towards adults. And then like teaching kids is a specific subset of ESL teaching. I know probably the vast majority of people over the last 10 to 15 years who entered in ESL probably got their start teaching kids either in Japan, South Korea, or China. And it was usually like into the public school system. In China, it was probably a private institute that would have hired them. But I know Japan and South Korea had government funded programs that brought over as many ESL teachers, natives, naturalized from the 7 countries, not from the 7 countries, but primarily from those 7 regions I mentioned before, bring them into the public school system in an effort to educate the elementary school children and the secondary school children in language or in the English language. I never did the young learners add-on as well. I taught kids for a while, and it's great to play games with them, but I'd rather teach adults as well. So with the CELTA, why did you take the CELTA?
Well, what happened was, as I mentioned to you before, I thought I was going to become a professor of ancient Greek and Roman history and philosophy.
Wow.
But I
Detour.
Well, and what happened was this was my first job after college. 2004, there was a minor recession in the States, and it was going to be a little bit before I could go to graduate school. So I took up this job, and I am a minimalist. I like easy living, but I want to really live in other countries, not just visit.
Yeah.
Teaching English. You kidding? I'm 21 years old, and I learned, wait a minute, you're telling me all I have to do is speak the language. I don't even have to really teach it, just speak it. And people pay me to come to their country?
Mm-hmm.
What's the downside? And the
with
CELTA.
the CELTA, I guess,
Mhm.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but I think a lot of us have that same sort of impression when we first find out that we can do that. I remember thinking that I'm like, really, just as an English speaker and like a Canadian passport holder, I can go teach anywhere. But I think the CELTA sort of changes the opinion of who can teach. What do you think?
I I knew that I might not be able to immediately go into the master's program. So I'd actually started into a preparation for doing secondary teaching in history.
Oh,
And
okay.
also, I could think back because I'd studied Latin in middle school and Spanish a little bit in high school, and I took German for 6 semesters in college and Chinese for 4 semesters. So I had some ideas about proper teaching and language, and I knew speaking. When it's 70 students or 60 students for 50 minutes a week, I'm not going to make any changes to their lives. And
Very
I'm not
little.
actually talking. It was exercises anyway. But I realized, okay, if I want to be competitive and if I want to believe that what I'm doing is actually of value, I ought to at least know what I'm doing. And so I researched, especially on Dave's ESL Cafe. While
Right.
now the website's dead, essentially, from the late 90s to about 2016, 2017. And some of the information there is still good.
Yeah, it's a good resource, good background research.
But I did my homework and I found out that there was CELTA was well respected, and also Trinity Colleges was also
Right.
well
That's the
respected.
TESOL, Trinity College TESOL, is it? Sir TESOL,
Yes.
what is that? Right.
And those
Do
were
you
the
know what the
big ones.
do you know what the difference is between them?
No, I don't. All I can say is that they are a lot of places that accept the CELTA will also accept that one. And I also know in Britain, for people who are British and listening, that they have a system of qualifications, and that Trinity and CELTA are treated as the same level of qualification in terms of being able to teach in private language schools in Britain.
Right. I think the primary difference would be I think CELTA is done by Cambridge and Trinity is done by Oxford. I think that's
I don't
right.
know. I don't know.
Good question, but I think it's an age-old battle sort of going
Yes.
on. I think that's sort of what it is, but I'm not entirely sure. Um, so you took this, and we've taken this. I mean, at separate places and at separate times. What did you learn about teaching English and about teaching languages that maybe you couldn't have learned had you just gone into it?
It teaches about what you need to think about. I know that sounds crazy, but it helps you to reverse engineer. You understand, you think about especially if you're being brought in by a school, but even if you're tutoring, it reminds you, you need to think about what the goals are or what are the objectives of this whole class. And from there, you can work backwards. You can start thinking, well, if I want them there, what kind of things do they need to be practicing or doing? All right. What do they need to learn? How can I help them learn that? Also, what kind of assessments along the way can I use? Can they use to know that they're actually making progress to those goals? It's a lot of things to think about. And all they really do is introduce you to these concepts. They are very clear about this. If you even pass or pass high or pass very, very high, they still make it clear you ought to be certainly observed in your teaching, and you need guidance. You still need guidance afterwards, but you can be put in the classroom and you're not going to hurt anybody.
Yeah. What do you mean by guidance?
Especially early teachers, it can be very hard to self-reflect on what's going on in the classroom. It can be easy to go one of two ways. Either, your students are incompetent or they just don't get you. A lot of teachers fall into that trap. On the flip side, some teachers think they're not immediately getting this. No one's quickly reacting to my questions. No one's understanding me. What am I going to do?
Yeah.
A lot of teachers quickly fall into one of these two areas where likely, hopefully, you may be a little bit arrogant about your abilities, but also you don't have enough experience to understand. Maybe the students do understand you. It's just, however, in whatever ways you want them to respond to you, maybe that's not how they do it culturally, or something else is going on. So
Yeah.
it's hard to know.
I found with the CELTA, it was a lot more practical in terms of its application. So you're talking about how you need sort of guidance after you've got the certificate already, but in terms of like when you rock on up or when you enter the classroom for the first time, and someone who's never taught before, which is what was happening with a lot of these government-run programs, they'd be university educated, so they'd be able to think and understand things and understand concepts, and they would be given a crash course, sort of 7-day introduction to how to teach an ESL classroom, which as a partner teacher might be okay if you're there for pronunciation purposes. But when the idea of the CELTA is to put you in the classroom as the teacher, as the educator, the English language educator that's going to take your students from point A of not knowing anything to point B of knowing something and being able to produce something. So with the CELTA, I found that it gave you, and it gave me those very practical steps in which to take, which you mentioned of conducting a class. If these are the objectives, how do we get there? What do we have to do? What sort of activities, what sort of testing or assessments do we need to be doing along the way? And for what level of age learners or what level of learners we're talking about as well? Is it elementary, secondary school, tertiary, private institute? Is it business English? Things like that. What are some of the terms you remember about from the CELTA? Because I think CELTA is very famous for using a few separate terms that other certificates might not use.
Well, of course, this is the early 2000s. The communicative approach was drilled into our heads so much. And I mean, it's a very nice working theory, and I see certainly the value. But when you get more than 15 or 20 students in the class, if you are not able to do group work or any of that, it just goes out the window.
So what is the communicative approach?
Hopefully, what is going on in the classroom is You try to make sure that the students understand the targeted language that you want them to be able to use, of course, but you minimize the amount of time that you're actually talking or presenting it.
The teacher is.
Hopefully, yes, that the
Yeah.
teacher, yes,
Yeah.
actively, maybe 20 to 30%
Right.
maximum. That the students are working in pairs or groups within the classroom, and that the teacher is able to observe, and depending on the mistakes that the teacher is looking for, it depends whether it's grammar, vocabulary, whatever. They give help maybe at the spot or let the students finish their conversation. Or as they're going around, the teacher makes mental notes and then we'll review it after the task or exercise is done, or maybe at the end of the whole class, depending on
Yeah.
the situation. And this all works fine and well in some contexts.
Usually in the smaller classrooms, like during the CELTA, they'll bring in volunteer students. So classrooms of 12 to maybe 18. I think the number that they give is 12 to 1. So 12 students per one teacher is sort of the maximum or the ideal number ratio for an ESL communicative ESL class. More than 12 can be accommodated, but it gets very difficult, especially if there's a very, very large difference between some of the language levels, the language abilities in the classroom. And yeah, anything more than 18 to one teacher, more than 9 pairs of students, it gets very difficult. Maybe 20 students total, but because that's 10 pairs. Yeah, the classroom sizes in some of these countries, 30, 40 students, even it's just can be chaos. So communicative approach is where we're trying to get students to talk more than we are, the teachers. Any other acronyms that you remember?
We covered, again, it's been a long time, 17 years. Yeah. I remember we talked about total physical response, TPR. We did talk briefly about some of the other methods. I don't remember what this method was called, but one of the proctors for the class, one of the two people who lead the course, John, he had with him these purple sticks,
Okay.
but also green and blue. And from context, we could figure out what must have been different colors, different numbers, things like this, showing that even you don't know any of the native language, and you are truly dealing with not a false beginner, but somebody who literally knows no English. You build up very slowly. There's a methodology to that. And there were a couple other methodologies, but I don't remember them because very quickly I didn't use them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think that's one thing that the CELTA sort of prides itself on. It does steer you towards the communicative approach, like it's a major focal point. The other methods, I think the one you're talking about is deductive learning or deductive teaching, whereas the student is given a bunch of situations here or objects, and they have to figure out for themselves what it is. I guess with all of that, it's good to understand those concepts and those methodologies, just so that when you go into the classroom and you face that situation of, are the students understanding or are they not understanding? You have other methods to draw upon. You don't have to focus just on one. Some of the acronyms I remember, these were very famous: ICQs and CCQs. Do you remember these?
I don't remember hearing that at all. Maybe this was added
Oh, no,
afterwards.
this is huge. ICQs, instruction checking questions, and
Oh,
CCQs,
those ideas I
concept
remember.
checking
Yes, yes.
question. Right.
Oh, I never heard it. Yes, concept checking questions. Never ask, do you understand? That tells you nothing.
Right. So what you mean by that, just to clarify, so ICQs and CCQs are a method wherein a teacher or an instructor will ask the class specific questions, usually in threes. Like there'll be three different questions that they'll ask, and it'll break it down from broad to middle, and then like a very specific question that has to be answered by the students that leads them into understanding what's supposed to go on. So in ICQs are instruction checking questions. What did I just tell you to do? How are you going to do it? Who are you going to do it with? Right. So that would be an example of that. CCQs, concept checking questions. Do you remember this one?
You can, yeah, the way you can do this is you can set scenarios or situations, and if the students you're able to elicit from the students the whatever you're looking for, then you know that they have understood it. Maybe they can even tell you that they understand it, but they can demonstrate it.
Right. And so you go through the concept that you're checking the understanding of the ideas of what you just you just taught. Maybe it's like present simple continuous, past simple continuous. Oh, I'm supposed to know these verb terms, but some of them they can get confusing after a while, which is why the CCQs are important.
Another important thing that came out of that class was most teachers aren't going to learn a lot about grammar. Let's be honest about that. That what is more important is you do your research. You're preparing a lesson, there are materials, and especially now with the internet, now in 2022, there's plenty of references and materials for you to adequately prepare. And especially if you're seeing classes several days a week, or even if it's just once a week, you can tell the student, that's a good question. I don't know. Next time we meet, I'll have an answer for you.
Yeah, I think that's a very important for, I guess it seems so obvious though. You know, as a teacher, I think a lot of times when we are growing up, we just assume that our teachers know everything. Because especially if we've had good teachers who did their homework and prepared for class, it's almost effortless, the classes that they conduct, right? And I think a lot of us haven't had to suffer through, or maybe we did, some of them, we had to suffer through classes we didn't want to be in, or maybe the teacher didn't want to be in. But I don't recall ever having a teacher like that throughout my entire schooling career. So, and I know, but for the ESL industry, I think it's probably a very common occurrence where either the students don't want to be there or the teacher is just doing a job, and maybe they're getting pushed around by the school, the administration, or maybe they're having culture shock, very important part. So there's other elements that can play where, you know, it's not just being able to teach one thing, but being able to prepare for class and present what you need to present, rather than having to know it all at once and then only picking out what you need to know, right? Knowing where to go to find the answer and then being able to deliver it in a way that the students can understand.
And I have just a short story about that. I had an interview with one of the managers of the schooling system for Saudi Aramco. That is Saudi Arabia's largest oil company. And at my interview, he asked me to explain something which was fairly esoteric. I don't remember what it was anymore. And I said to him, I hadn't dealt with that topic in years. But then I went on to explain, as a professional, if I know I'm going to be teaching, I'm responsible to do my homework and do all that. And he looked at me, he said, yeah, you're right. I did wind up getting that job, and I did wind up working at the same place where he was based. He wasn't my direct manager. He was the head of the campus, but that is a good reason, and managers will understand that. Now, this is opposite. When I first got my CELTA, I was interviewing for jobs in New York City, and occasionally they would ask me a grammar question, and sometimes I was able to explain. Sometimes I would say, well, I don't know much about it. I would have to research it. And these guys would go out the door, had no interest in me. Okay.
The competition was that high in New York that you had to have that grammatical proficiency. Because the CELTA doesn't focus on it. It glances on it.
And I think that those teachers were just looking for a simple way, those administrators were looking for a simple way to just go through people, cut these people out in the interviews,
Yeah,
rather than
probably.
actually listen to the logic of what I was saying.
Yeah, because they probably had so many more people to choose from than rather than, I don't know, study Aramco or a lot of these places
Well,
overseas where how many people are willing to apply, how many people can go, and how many people will actually show up, right?
yeah, that's true. You sent to
Uh,
me earlier a grammar book, which was introduced to me when I was taking the CELTA, maybe a different edition, but this is a godsend for especially new teachers, but even experienced. I don't remember the name of it. The
I think
parrot
it's
book.
grammar. It's Martin Parrott, grammar for English language teachers, and the course I'm doing right now, the Delta Module One. Yeah, basically we're you, essential reading chapters 1 through 40. Well, there's only 32 chapters. It's basically I think we actually start reading at chapter 8 of the 2010 edition. I can't. Yeah, it did change editions, but as English teachers, English language teachers, not just English teachers, English language teachers,
Right.
reading that book is very useful, very helpful. And there's a couple other books that on the Delta syllabus that we have to read, or it's recommended to read in order to understand what's going on. The CELTA doesn't have the same reading list as the Delta, but we can get to that. In terms of the CELTA, so we've done communicative approach, ICQs, CCQs. There was another one, not an acronym, but a term, eliciting, that came out from that course. Do you remember how to do eliciting?
It is better to get students to make their own context to use the language that you want them to practice.
Hmm.
You may ask them leading questions or give a little bit of context, but then get them to react and then build from them so they feel more attached to whatever is being reviewed or taught. And they might not think of it
Yeah,
as actual learning per se.
but
And
it
it's
it's
challenging.
and because and it also helps with confidence as well, because when they're able to figure something else out on their own without having, the teacher just give them the answer, it does sort of, um, if not reinforce, then support self-learning, like learning on your own, self-study, and making sure you spend time with the language outside of the classroom rather than just depending on a teacher-led classroom, even if it is the communicative approach.
Yes.
So the CELTA, how many weeks were you in the CELTA? Was it 4 weeks or 5 weeks?
It was 4 weeks. I think it was set for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. Now, honestly speaking, there's a lunch break, and then there's time when there's observed teaching. It's not really that, as long as it sounds, it's really not.
But that's the full-time course. Like it's a job, basically. You have to treat it like a job. You cannot half-ass your approach to that course. It demands. It's an intensive 4 weeks. I remember
It's
that,
certainly intensive. It's certainly
especially
intensive.
if it's your first time teaching ESL. Like even if you have a university degree, university doesn't teach you those skills unless you've done
Right.
education degrees,
Yes.
obviously.
Yes.
But for a first time ESL teacher, it's a shock at just how much you have to prepare, and they have a very strict standard, which I appreciate now having gone through it. The course, the objectives and developing what do you not the syllabus for the class,
Yeah.
but the whole, like, the procedures, basically
Mhm.
coming out with the warm up, the icebreaker, and then going through the setup and through everything else, sort of thing. Appreciating the standard structure that they give you, so that when your school asks you for your class syllabus or class outlines, you can do it. It's not something new that you have to go research.
The pass rate is fairly high. I think the pass rate is like 90 or 95%. But the reason is they don't just take anybody off the streets. I remember, I'd forgotten about this. There's actually not the most intensive interview, But I remember I had an interview for about 20 minutes.
Yeah. It was so they do ask you, and it's not just the interview. They have a preparatory booklet that they send you
Oh,
before the interview, I
yes.
think, that you have
I
to.
forgot about that.
It's recommended that you go through it, if not before the interview, then before the course, so you have an understanding of what's expected of you going into the course. But yeah, it's a very intensive program. I'm glad I did it. I don't look back at that at all and say that
Yes,
it was a waste, and especially the fact that I did it in Montreal. I think it was probably added to the experience of learning how to teach ESL overseas. How much did your course cost you back when you did it
so,
in U.S.
sorry.
dollars?
The class was taught in the Empire State Building.
That's cool.
There were only 3 or 4 training places in all of the United States. I lived in northern New Jersey, so I could commute.
Right.
I'd walk to the bus stop, it'd drop me off at the Port Authority. I walk 6 blocks, 8 blocks, and I'm there. I didn't
Wow.
have to move to San Francisco, move to LA, and I think Miami was the other place.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe. I don't know.
so it was a little bit more than $2,000 at that time.
Yeah. I paid 2,400 Canadian for Montreal, and just like in it's shocking that in the United States there'd only be so few spaces. You'd think there'd be more. In Canada, I think it was Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. So I had to go to Montreal and live. But Montreal it's a beautiful city, very affordable, cheap living accommodations. It was during the summer. I just missed the Just for Laughs comedy festival, but I was there for the Montreal Film Festival, which is now done. But so I did have to relocate, but the cost of doing the course and living in Montreal was well worth it for what I got on the other side of that. So yeah, I don't regret that at all. I think it's a standard fee throughout the world. I
It
think it's
is.
priced in US dollars, and then it's sort of you have, if you're going to go to Hungary or Argentina. Actually, I'm not even sure. I thought it was cheaper in Argentina. I looked
Well,
at Argentina, but it was the fact that I had to go to Argentina just made it financially not viable.
what I understand is that if you are, for example, if you're taking it, let's say in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City, and you're one of the locals, as in you are a local Vietnamese, the British Council, no, not the British Council, excuse me, the University of Cambridge offers scholarships sometimes because they
Oh, okay.
understand that your salary, it might be several months' salary to
Yeah.
pay for this,
Yeah.
which is a
And
real challenge.
but even with the CELTA, they sort of promote this because although it does focus a lot on the communicative teaching aspect, they do deal. There's at least one day where they talk about the job situation, and like career advancement through like, 'cause
Yeah,
your CELTA is sort of seen as your basic step, your entrance into teaching ESL around the world, teaching English around the world. And they talk about dealing with administrations, dealing with principals, dealing with coworkers as well, culture shock, so
yeah.
adopting to or adapting to a new culture, a new place, what to expect for like in terms of remuneration or payments, your salary, benefits that you could look for, where to go teach. Uh, no surprise that China, South Korea, Japan came up quite a bit. And then like sort of what you yourself should be charging, or what you should feel comfortable charging as an ESL professional, as a language professional, that after you finish the CELTA, there's a certain price that you can charge for your services, given that you're probably university educated. Now you have a standard worldwide recognized certificate in teaching the English language. There's a price that can be put on that, that I think people would agree is fair for a good language teacher who knows what they're doing.
Yes.
So after the CELTA, you went to go travel, teach in China. I think I came to China actually. Go figure. We both went to China after we did the CELTA. But in terms of career progression, if someone wants to keep on going after the CELTA, where have you sort of seen the careers go, or what did you think the career could be after doing the CELTA?
Well, I got the CELTA just to make sure that I could go to a lot of different places. I never had interest in going into administration,
Right.
no interest at all. And however, I like certainly a high degree of independence. You tell me
Okay.
what to do, and then you leave me alone, and I'll
Yeah.
do it. And and so from the CELTA, after a few more years, you're allowed to sit for the Delta, if you so like. The
Yeah.
diploma, also University of Cambridge run, as you know.
Which is what
And
I'm doing
then
right now.
and then people from there, you might go into curriculum development. Maybe you're tasked with not only designing one class, but a sequence of classes for a whole program. Now,
Yeah.
usually you're talking about being 35, 40 years old. You have quite a bit of teaching experience. If you're teaching a sequence of classes,
Yeah.
usually they don't give that to somebody who's 27 or 28 because it requires a lot of work experience, usually to be able to successfully have to understand how different courses are going to interact, how you're bringing different things together to build as a base for other classes. There's
Mhm.
curriculum development, there's materials development. Now, you're going to say, Denny, well, teachers start developing materials from day one.
Denny, teachers start developing their materials from day one.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. But just because you start developing materials doesn't necessarily mean that they are good quality or, as a one-off, they may
Yeah.
function or work. But making it for a set course that's going to be taught again and again, maybe by a variety of teachers or used in different contexts, there's a lot more to think about.
Right.
Those are
That's
two big things.
because I'm doing the Delta right now, and the Delta is split up into three different modules. So module 1, 2, and 3. Module 1 is more of the theoretical uh, appreciation of the English of ELT, English language teaching. Delta module 3 is where you develop your own course. You do what's called a needs analysis. So you uh, I guess you survey or you create a questionnaire for a student or a group of students, and you figure out what they need. And then from that, you build a syllabus or a course targeting their needs. And then you present that at the end of that course, module 3. Module 2, I think, is the practicum, where you're actually in the classroom and you are not only developing the course, I'm not sure if you're developing the course or you're conducting it, but you're dealing with different applications in a classroom environment, and you're being observed. Whereas module 1 and module 3, it's sort of you work on your own mostly. Module 2, I think you're a bit more hands-on or a bit more involved with the guiding instructor, as it were. Also not an easy course, lots of reading, just but as you were saying, it's it's not easy for someone who doesn't have the experience. And I didn't realize this, but sometimes they say that the Delta is a very challenging course, but much like the CELTA is an intensive course, especially if you've never taught before and you're fresh out of university. Even experienced teachers had difficulty with the CELTA, and they usually got merits, like they passed with merits because they were that good. They had the experience. But with the Delta, they do say that you need the CELTA, first of all, or something equivalent, so you have an understanding of what's expected of how to teach. But then you also need some experience in a real classroom. Some people try to do the CELTA and then the Delta right after, and they get schooled in it. By that I mean they have a very rough time of it, and I'm not sure of the success rate of it.
When
So it,
I am unsurprised because when I anyway had studied for the CELTA, it was required. It was required that you work 2 or 3 years after you've earned your CELTA before you can apply for the Delta. It was required. Maybe they've changed, I guess it changed it.
maybe because market dynamics, they've changed it, but I don't think that's an unfair number. 3 years. I mean that because the first year is your honeymoon period. You know, you're sort of getting
Mhm.
used to it, and not just the
Yeah.
honeymoon period. I mean, you're panicked I think is probably a better word. It's not so much a honeymoon as you're panicked, going, oh my goodness, there's real faces looking at me,
Yeah.
and they're asking me about grammar questions that I don't know. Year two, you kind of honing in on what you did in year one. By year three, you have a process. You know how you as a teacher conduct the class and what you're able to do and what you're not able to do, and you have resources that are available to you as well. And so that's a good number. 2 to 3 years is a good number to have before you do the Delta, especially since you're probably familiar with more of the terminology and the concepts that they talk about in the Delta. Did you ever think about doing the Delta?
No, no.
Why not?
Well, this goes back to why you made the comment earlier about the CELTA not being so popular in the United States. A lot of the right, if you were in a CELTA in the United Kingdom, you're qualified to teach also near university systems for ESL programs or things like that. In the United States, usually to do that, I was an exception to this rule. Usually you need a master's degree or at least a certificate, 24 hours of undergraduate study in
Right.
ESL teaching or something like that. I wound up doing half of what was required for a master's degree in applied linguistics online from Macquarie University in Australia. What happened
Okay.
was, it's 2008, 2009. I have a son now. I'm married. I have a son who's almost one. And I'm looking at, again, ways to extend my choices. And I was aware of the Delta, but I knew that if I had a master's degree, that actually I'd be able to apply to even more places.
Right.
And applied linguistics. So as we've mentioned before, am I real, like, for example, phonology, am I into linguistics? Not really. Applied linguistics, I can stay into an area that I'm focused on. The reason I didn't finish the course was life got in the way. Things got very complicated. And it was an intensive system. It was a two semesters. It's only 2 semesters. I completed the first semester. And in the end, the reason I did it, so life got in the way. I did consider going back to it. But in the end, I realized I probably didn't want to go into admin anyway. And typically, when you go to the master's degree, they're going to be wanting to put other things on you.
Yeah.
I really don't want to administer or manage something. I can be given the authority to set a curriculum, to make my own assessments. I can do
Yeah.
that, and I have training in it.
Yeah.
I might not be the greatest, but I can do it well. And if
But you don't
somebody
want to
else,
deal with other people in that. You don't want to work with a team that has to implement some sort of syllabus or course.
I'm not somebody that's going to put the screws on somebody's thumbs. That's
Right.
not me.
Yeah.
And and if and I can accept feedback. You know, the managers are responsible to make sure that I'm doing what's necessary in the classroom. They tell me I'm doing it wrong. I do my work well, but they tell me I'm not
Mhm.
doing it right. The reason I accepted the job was to do what
Right.
that program is. I'll change it. Fine. Okay, fine.
I've been told the Delta, actually, I just learned this a couple weeks ago, that one of the reasons why some people do the Delta, because they're kind of almost like you, where they're kind of going, their impression of the Delta is administration, is materials development. And it's like, well, why do I have to learn how to do materials development when, I make materials all the time? And but the Delta focuses more on publishing those and like larger, broad scale application of materials development rather than just for your one class sort of thing. Um, the Delta, what you complete as in the Delta can be used for some master's programs, and I think it can take up
Yes,
to 40% of the credits or something like
yes.
that. I was just informed about this, so this is sort of a pleasant surprise. Although, to be honest, um, I don't know if I want to do another master's degree.
Um, so for a long time, there was a university in Ankara in central Turkey where, as a part of their program, you sign on to teach at their university for 3 years, and you will also earn a master's degree or a Delta, right?
All
They
right.
they split it. And if you sign up for 4 years, it's merged, you get both.
Right. It's
Build
not a bad idea.
University or something like that. I don't know if they offer anymore, but for at least a decade, that was what they were offering.
I believe I would think that those programs still exist somewhere. I'm not sure where they are, but it sounds like you'd also be you'd be studying the Delta or the whatever the certificate or master's on a part-time basis. So
Right.
you'd be teaching. It would probably be best for people who have some experience already, but who need the income of a job, but want the overseas experience, or and they want to pursue those certificates or diplomas. So it's because you are really capturing a lot with a program like that, where you're able to move to another place, have a contract, have a job, paying you money, and the course is taken care of. Like you sort of don't need to do too much more thinking in terms of where you will finish your qualifications. Um, so going forward, CELTA, the Delta, I guess, would you recommend people to take the CELTA or some other ESL certificate? Like, what about these online certificates? What do you think?
The problem with the online certificates is that it's really haphazard. And it
Mm,
depends on how serious you are about it. If you just need something to put on your resume, and a lot of countries don't pay any attention, right? The owner of the school or whatever will apply for your work visa, and here's a certificate. They don't know CELTA from the back of their hand.
mhm.
And so if you're just looking for an easier way to get into a country, then get in online. If you're serious about studying and becoming a good teacher, or to verify that you are a good teacher,
Yeah.
verify it, right? You do the CELTA program, and it has the name recognition also. The online programs, I am sure there are plenty of good online programs. The problem is you're going to have to be able to find independent reviews of it, and that can be very challenging.
Whereas the CELTA sort of it's a standard. I mean, you
Right.
mentioned the word CELTA in most ESL circles, and most people will understand. Same with the Delta. Although, to be honest, with the Delta, I've been told that China doesn't really recognize it. Canada might recognize it, but it seems like the Middle East would sort of be the place that you sort of you want to you'd be looking towards if
Yes,
you're going to be
definitely.
taking if you're going to be completing the Delta. Um, for online certificates, yeah, I think if you needed it to for the if you needed a quick certification, I think that would sort of be where it fits in. But I think you'll soon find that because the basics of teaching aren't very difficult. The theory of of ELT, probably a lot of it isn't necessary. And so an ESL certificate is just sort of one like online would give you the very basics, but you won't have that classroom experience. You probably who's reviewing it is another question, like whether or not they are qualified or able to actually give you constructive feedback, which is like the CELTA prides itself on having very harsh tutors or instructors feedback on all of the issues that they see happening in your classes. So it's a little bit it's intense in that regard.
Cambridge, I forgot this. The University of Cambridge sent somebody to observe our proctors, not to observe
Yes,
the students,
yeah,
for a
and they
couple
do
of
that.
days
They
every
we
session.
had a girl from a girl. She was a lady from Qatar, I think, and this is where I learned the pronunciation of the word Qatar. It's not Qatar or Qatar or anything else. It's Qatar, and she was sent around the world because Delta only ends once a month, basically. So it's on a rolling basis. The CELTA does, and so she would go observe these proctors or tutors. We call them tutors. I guess you're calling them proctors. That instructors, course
Yeah,
instructors, that to make sure that they are upholding the standards of the CELTA, which was, I mean, now I think if it go, wow, that their jobs were actually on the line. They were being observed. But and we actually had a separate class with her without the instructors around. So the instructors were sent away, and we had a we had a classroom with this lady from Qatar who would answer all the questions about sort of the career path, like what the CELTA is and
yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you, with me doing the Delta right now, I have I have the exam in 1 month, so there's a lot more reading. I can say that after being in the ESL industry for so long, it's not all of it. It's not new, but it's not entirely uh, common knowledge either. You probably are familiar with a lot of the concepts or a lot of the readings that you have to do, and it focuses on everything. I mean, it's reading, writing, listening, your speaking skills, phonology, like how to listen, how to teach listening, how to teach pronunciation, and then dealing with testing or assessment, like making sure that your test has validity, so it's actually appropriate for who you are teaching and what you are teaching, and things like that. So it's very almost comprehensive in its theoretical outlay, its theoretical needs or requirements for module 1. Module 3, that's when you start researching how to actually create course materials, which I'm interested in doing as well. Module 2, I mean, I think is another whole beast altogether, and I think it takes quite a while to get through that one. I can't remember.
How are you going to do the observed teaching in the end?
Well, I'm not going to right now. So I'm going to do module 1 right now. I'm going to do module 3 probably starting in January, and then module 2 I have to find. I don't know if it has to be in a university, or if it can be like I have a volunteer student who can play the role of being, a dutiful student sort of thing. Or I don't know if it can be a private institute or a university. So that one I don't know. I'm not focused on it just yet.
Oh, well, my meaning more is you complete modules 1 and 3.
Yeah.
How long do those expire once you pass?
No.
Is there a limit as to how long you can take to do module 2?
No. It hasn't changed in years. It's a standard. They did change the testing requirements for module 1, like sort of how they structured the test, but overall the material stays the same. They actually, it's a very good point that you ask whether or not it expires. In the Delta application materials, they say it doesn't expire. Once you pass module 1, you have module 1 from now until like forever, sort of thing. So in that case, it's very good. Now, how long do you remember all the things you learned? It's not so much that module 2 requires module 1 and module 3. It's that the knowledge that you accumulate in module 1 and module 3, or actually in module 1, I should say, not module 3, that you accumulate in module 1, which is all the theoretical stuff, supports module 2.
What?
So
Right.
that's the idea of it. The reason for the modules is because people didn't want to commit that much money and that much time to doing a diploma when they could go do a master's degree instead. Right. So
Right.
that's why they cut it up into the 3 segments, so you could do bits and parts, different parts of the world, different times of your career. You didn't feel the stress or the need, the pressure to do it all at once and commit that much time and energy and financial resources, especially like taking time off work to do it. So I think that's why they cut it into the 3 modules. It's like a master's degree, except it's a diploma.
For a reasonable person.
Yeah, a diploma being more, it's a diploma isn't the same as because it's not conferred by a university. So it's sanctioned. It's okay, not sanctioned. It's stamp of approval by a university, but it doesn't have to be conducted at a university. Whereas a master's degree is typically in a university setting.
Well, the University of Cambridge is still handling quality control in the materials that are used in the classroom. So, I mean, that's
stamp of approval, but it doesn't have to be done at a university, right? Like there's no, I'm not a graduate of the University of Cambridge because I did the Delta.
I have seen some foreigners who will say, I've got a CELTA, I have this certificate from the or the Delta, right? This diploma from the University of Cambridge. I've met some foreigners who will say this to people in other countries.
Well, it
And
is
I'm
funny.
just,
Yeah, but you did that in New York. That doesn't count. You did that in Montreal. Doesn't count. But of all places I'd like to go visit that I've never been to, Cambridge and Oxford in England. I'd love to go there at some point just to go walk through the halls and the libraries and the alleyways to see what sort of spurred such academic rigor, vigor, intensity. They've been around for a while, right?
autism.
Autism. All right.
Isaac,
So anything else that people should know about the various ESL certificates? We've covered the CELTA, the Delta, our reasons for doing it, some of the things that we learned along the way, the career progression, whether or not people should do the Delta or a master's degree, and sort of how people can look at entering in the ESL industry. I guess the one last thing is, how relevant is all of this in the face of online teaching and this continuous pandemic that's going on right now? What would you say to that?
I was asked to help set up a teacher training program here in Georgia. I was approached by a language school to do that. And I explained to them that it is much more complicated than they thought. But also, an added layer is the fact that, as you pointed out, because of the coronavirus and going forward, a lot more instruction is going to be online. And in my opinion, any good training program, especially beginner level, also goes over the basics of using different kinds of software and effective teaching online. There's just no choice anymore. And teaching things like pronunciation, if that's your love, if that's your passion, in my opinion, God help you, because it's challenging online. And so
Yeah.
if you're looking into programs, look into that. Because yes, for example, you might find a job in Peru, you go down into Peru, but then you're under lockdown. You can't leave your home, but you're teaching online now. Uh-oh, you need to figure out how to use Zoom or how to use Teams or this or that. You have no
ClassIn was
idea.
the other one we were using.
And and that's a lot. And so
Yeah.
in my opinion, if you're looking to go in now, look for programs that offer this. And I would be surprised if CELTA doesn't. Like we mentioned before, CELTA did teach some basic theories for other modes. And with the coronavirus pandemic issues going on now for almost 3 years, I think they would have adapted to what they teach.
I'm thinking with the like how I think the coronavirus, like this pandemic, sort of surprisingly caught a lot of us off guard. But that in the last 3 years, online technology to teach things like English have gotten a lot better. So the whole, like, the Zoomification, like, using Zoom or Google Meet, Skype, or ClassIn is the other one that we use, which is specific for teaching. It's become a lot easier to set up a classroom environment rather than before, where it was Skype or phone calls. It was very
Yeah,
difficult.
yes.
And so the software has improved a lot in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And so I think it does still come down to a lot of teaching, like the mechanics of teaching. So the technology plays a part of it, but at the same time, you still have to understand how to get students to talk to each other. The one thing that you might need to sort of allow for is connection issues. And I don't mean between students, I mean the connections of the actual class, the glitches that happen with the internet and stuff like that.
And sufficiently, this kills the communicative approach. Trying to break people into pairs or groups and then monitoring is essentially impossible.
Right.
And
Well,
it's
I
been a real
wonder,
challenge.
yeah, maybe the internet speeds aren't there just yet for it to not as ubiquitous or not as around the world as it is in some places. Like China has decent internet connection in the big cities. Canada, like major cities, would have it, but smaller towns might be sort of left on the outside of this access to education for the time being.
Well, my meaning, I should be clear. I should be clear. In the classroom, you have a group over here, a group over there, and so on and so forth. You can see what's going on if there are problems. I may be listening in on this group, but I can still hear in the periphery what's going on in that group. As far as I know, if you have breakout rooms for your students, and as a teacher, right, you step back, there's no programs where you can observe what's going on in all of the groups. There's no way that you can just listen because that's too much. Apparently, there's no programs right now anyway that do that.
I think one of the good things about online teaching is that you don't have to deal with discipline. And I think as much as language teachers, I think this goes back to us talking about teaching adults and not teaching kids. Like kids are usually being forced to take these classes where adults want to be there. Now, that being said, we might have been wary of cell phones in the classroom, but now with online teaching, everything is recorded and can be screenshotted and posted. So it's important to have an understanding of, like, you have to remain professional, but at the same time, you don't have to deal with the same discipline issues that you'd have in a classroom. And if there is someone being troublesome, I think it's actually not difficult to block them from the class, I think. So it is a little bit easier in that regard, but you do have to be aware that your face, your words, they are being recorded and they can and will be published, or they could be published, right? So that's the one thing. Even though I don't think a lot of students are like that, I don't think teachers are like that, but it is certainly a possibility for sure.
Yeah.
All right, we've talked quite a bit. I think that pretty much sums it up. That's a pretty thorough introduction and discussion of the different ESL certificates available. So again, we talked about the getting into ESL teaching, CELTA, the Delta, the Trinity Certisol, and going into master's degrees or other ESL certificates and education, the career development of an English language teacher, whether in a native English speaking country or overseas, more likely overseas. All right. Anything else to add there, Denny?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Denny. We'll talk again.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
Bye.